Welcome to News from Neptune for January 10th in the second week of 2020. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist actually means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a U.S. War Crimes edition of News from Neptune. I want to mention that tomorrow afternoon, there is an answer panel discussion on war finance and related matters at the Independent Media Center in Champaign. It's an information session on local defense contracts, and I use the word defense in the paradoxical way that we use it in this country. Means war making.
Well, you know, if the National Answer is having rallies and they're inviting Max Blumenthal to speak at those rallies, then I don't see how any conscientious person, I'm being facetious.
Any conscientious person can stay away, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, according to the undercurrent in the anti-war movement, and partly why there is no anti-war movement, or has been no anti-war movement, has had a lot to do with the manner in which the sectarian sort of intra-left or intra-Marxist sectarian conflicts over Syria and over the attitudes of people like Blumenthal and his primary colleagues, Rania Khalek and Ben Norton and Aaron Mate, have dealt with the Syria conflict over the last few years, and this has created an enormous amount of vitriol on the left. It's affected the pro-Palestine movement, which really doesn't exist anymore either on a national or local level. So what are the prospects of Answer being able to heal some of these rifts, not to mention the personal rifts that have transpired, that began to transpire as far back as 2005, as you well know, Carl, and you're often referring to an article that you wrote in Counterpunch at that time about President Obama's visit to our local train station, and the train left, and the anti-war movement left shortly thereafter, and we see the sort of the wreckage of that as we survey the manner in which the anti-war movement has evolved, the manner in which Obama evolved, the manner in which Trump evolved, the manner in which the debates over black politics and Afro-pessimism have evolved as we have become in the sort of the post-Black Lives Matter era. There really is, I know I'm all over the place here, but there really seems to be a lot of, there's going to have to be some clarity here. Maybe Answer can provide that as to what it means to be anti-war, what the socialist basis for an anti-war movement is. Otherwise, we're just back to where we started with, bend the arc and the pro immigrant movement that supports mainstream Democratic corporate neoliberal policies.
As the poet,
How's that for early an early digression into our program?
Regression on repression.
Yeah.
And there's more of that to come, I'm afraid. As the poet says, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to return to the place where we started and know it for the first time. And if that's true of the American anti-war movement these days, that would be great. The panel discussion tomorrow that I referred to has an interesting angle. They're particularly concerned with the money being spent by the Pentagon and the State Department too on defense contracts, that is war making, in Champaign County particularly. And naturally most of that runs through the university, but not all. $300 million in defense contracts. Actually, it's the other way around. $300 million in defense contracts are awarded to Champaign County recipients.
Right.
That surprised even me after years of talking about this, that there is that much money coming in to Champaign County from the Defense Department, and only $80 million, a mere $80 million, a mere $80 million is awarded to the university. Well, I don't know about the accounting on that and exactly what counts as Champaign County, what counts as the university, but in any case, there are large amounts, certainly in terms of the local economy, and we should be aware of what is going on literally in our backyard on these matters. The people running the panel discussion tomorrow say CU residents should know how their community is directly involved with aiding U.S. imperialism. And I don't think you disagree with that, wouldn't you, David?
No.
The panel that I'm talking about is from 3 to 4 tomorrow afternoon, Saturday, January 11th, at the Independent Media Center, 202 South Broadway Avenue in Urbana. The event is hosted by a group calling itself Answer CU. A line comes from another unlikely place that tops my notes tonight. Tucker Carlson's program on the 2nd, quote, "If Trump does this, that is, goes to war with Iran, his re-election is toast," close quote. That's interesting. I'm not sure that's true, but it might be. And the American public is not happy with the U.S. going to war. An interesting sidelight of that was that when the war talk last week peaked, there was a rush to consult the Selective Service Agency of the United States government, that is the draft system. So much so that their computers crashed. Too many people wanted to know, it was good heavens, if there's war, is there going to be a draft, and am I eligible? And that's not an unreasonable question.
I'm surprised that, if it's younger people doing that, I'm even surprised that they know that there ever was a draft.
Exactly. And the fact that this sort of consciousness is being raised necessarily by U.S. crimes is no bad thing, because it may lead us to think about those crimes and object to them even more. It's the comment from the peculiar Tucker Carlson program the other night was, "It looks like Trump started the war in Iran that neocons have fantasized about for decades." Actually, it's been carried on for decades. The U.S. reportedly, this is the Tucker Carlson program, reportedly killed top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, and the PMU head, that is the militia groups in Iraq. The reportedly is hardly necessary. That is indeed what happened. And in the aftermath of that, an Iranian surface-to-air missile seems to have shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane with 176 people aboard. So it's a week of tragedy of all sorts, tragedy bound up with U.S. war-making, which hardly began this week. It's been a staple of American policy literally for generations. But I think it's correct to say that Israel and its U.S. lobby and the neocons in general have managed, since we last met, to achieve a long-term objective, that is direct U.S.-Iranian military conflict. Now, to call it indirect leaves its victims just as dead, but the direct conflict of this past week is obviously what the war party in Washington and the Israel lobby have been aiming for many a day, and it looks like they may have got some version of it from the Trump administration. We'll talk more about that and some other things on the agenda today. What's the top of your list, David?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on what you said
Okay.
by raising the issues of what, whether the anti-war movement, whether the putative anti-war movement that some think was and never, and then ended, and now I've been reading a lot of headlines, not so many articles, but some headlines about how the anti-war movement is back. And the question is, how is it back? Is it back on the basis of the answer groups, a coalition of leftist groups and socialist groups and, I don't know, maybe anarchist groups? I don't know what an anarchist is these days anymore. That's another Chomskyan term that doesn't have any meaning anymore. But anyway, why is it that you refer to Tucker Carlson as being anti-war and not some other media figure? Oh, well, maybe because on the mainstream media, that is Fox News, he's like the only one who has come out as anti-war. So, and then there's the Democratic Party anti-war movement, I guess you would say, nice article or relatively neutral or sympathetic coverage in the News Gazette this morning of a demonstration yesterday over by the courthouse here of 30 of our friends and former friends who congregated there to oppose the war. But the question with this particular group of people, some of whom I know and some of whom fewer of whom I actually like or actually get along with anymore, the question becomes: is this an anti-Trump movement or is it an anti-war movement? Is it an anti-Tucker Carlson movement or an anti-war movement? Do we have a pragmatic movement? We, and I say we, I don't think I'm going to be part of this anyway, but still, do we, in the general sense of the word, have a red-brown anti-war movement? I mean, we've talked many times in this program about all the criticism of supposed red-brown movements or left-right movements against war, and then we've of course talked about the problematic nature of the manner in which, particularly the pro-immigrant movement, has played itself out within the confines of the establishment Democratic Party. So I see a lot of vicissitudes going on here, which answer is, I suppose, has a reputation historically for dealing with the broad range of groups and just providing a platform. But again, there will be sectarianism here. There will be Democratic Party. There will be anti-Trumpism here in the narrow sense of the word, not in the broader anti-neoliberal, anti-neoconservative sense of the word. There will be the question of do you ally? I mean, this is what these people are always talking about: allies, not solidarity, but allies, and that's characteristic of neoliberal language these days. So there's a lot of problematic stuff on the table here, a lot of baggage as we talk about this meeting tomorrow or this demonstration yesterday regarding whether the anti-war movement.
And there is a subtle, but I think very dangerous movement in American politics, and it's not innocent. I mean, it's not something that's happened by accident. As to say, it's the conscious policy of the American political establishment, and that is to take the dismay about American policy and turn it into anti-Trumpism alone. instead of actually criticizing and opposing and changing the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of all recent administrations. Those are the policies that produce more war and more austerity, not by accident. They're designed to do so. Instead of opposing those policies, we oppose the manifestation, or told to oppose the manifestation of those policies when they turn up in the vicious orange man that we all love to hate. That's, as I say, that's not just a category mistake. That's not just a misunderstanding what it is that we need to oppose. It's an attempt to defend those very policies that we need to oppose by saying whatever's wrong with them is the result of the peculiar character of Donald Trump. And that's it's a subtle but important and I think very deep difference. And it's the difference that the liberal political establishment in this country, that is, call it the permanent government or the deep state or what you want, has been working on for a long time. It's not an accident, as I say. It's a policy. It's a policy of the American political establishment, a way to handle those very objections to government policy that made Trump president in the first place, and that that need to be handled by misdirection. That's what's happening. Hate Trump, and let's go back to business as usual, as in the Obama administration. That's the position of the American political establishment, and Trump, of course, is aiding it by adopting the policies of the Obama administration as he rails against them. And the Iran business is an illustration of the confusion, purposeful in the case of the political establishment, and perhaps accidental in the case of the Trumpists. But in any case, we should make clear who our enemies are, what policies are that we oppose, and why we oppose them.
Yeah. Well, Carl, I've been a little bit contrary to you on some of these issues in recent programs, and I'm not totally retracting what I have to say, but it's clear that Trump isn't a strategic thinker, whereas Obama was in a way invited a certain strategy, which did lead to the Iran deal and so forth, but also perpetuated the wars in the Middle East and our presence in that region. It's interesting to me that I think that what I was really going for was just some sort of balance in terms of understanding Obama's term in terms of that same context, that Obama was clearly sort of a more conscious and willing actor in shaping his foreign policy, and consulted with Thomas Friedman and all these other people.
That's the penalty he had to pay.
Had these Thursday night meetings where all the wise heads would talk about these things, and he was thoroughly ensconced in the neoconservative, geopolitical strategy. Whereas Trump, I think you're perhaps right in, or somebody was right in claiming that Trump sent these missiles off to kill these people in a fit of pique, or in a kind of instinctive response to what was going on there, or at the bequest of Mike Pompeo or whoever was at his side. It doesn't really matter, but both Obama and Trump need to be seen in that context. And the problem I have with the re-emerging anti-war movement is that they're gonna forget what they were dealing with from 29 to 2016. The last time that I can recall when there was that many people as there were yesterday at an anti-war demonstration in this community was probably related to Syria in 2013, when there was a threat that they'd crossed the red line, and Obama didn't end up, bombing, or he didn't end up sending in troops or whatever. And that's been about it, other than maybe some protests related to Gaza in 2014. The anti-war movement has been really dormant, and it's been dormant because it's unfocused, and people are not committed to it in any fundamental way, other than a kind of partisan way, a partisan posturing kind of way. And I'm very much worried, I'm very much concerned that this demonstration yesterday was as much of an anti-Trump demonstration as it was an anti-war demonstration.
Exactly. And that is indeed a knot that we have to untie, and in order to talk about this matter clearly. I am glad to say, if that's not too much, that the horrible events of this last week have seemed to have pushed the reluctant Democratic candidate for president, Bernie Sanders, into a clearer position on American wars. Sanders has talked about his opposition to those wars and to the and his vote against the invasion of Iraq and so forth, but he is not been less than overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the anti-war movement, as we are saying also about some of our friends and associates here in town. But the events of this week led Bernie Sanders to say, and I quote, "I will do everything I can to stop a war with Iran." And Aaron Maté, who writes very well on these matters, says, and he's already done a lot. Back in 2017, Senator Sanders was the only member of the Democratic caucus in either chamber, the House or the Senate, to vote against new sanctions on Iran. We want to talk about sanctions a little today,
Yes,
if we
absolutely,
have a chance,
absolutely.
because the Trump administration has just announced in a new sanctions on Iran, and a joint news conference of the Secretaries of the Treasury and the Secretary of State this morning, a horrible Tweedledum and Tweedledee pair of Pompeo and Mnuchin, have discussed further sanctions on Iran, and there's a tendency,
Which is war.
which is war. That's my
Yes.
point exactly, and it's important to see that that's true. Our chief researcher Jeff Nicholson has sent around an extremely accurate column from Caitlin Johnstone from last summer on sanctions as war, precisely. And in fact, as we go on today, I may read some of Johnstone's column, because she's saying things that are not said in the American press about sanctions as war, on a day in which the American government, in the shape of these two awful cabinet secretaries, have announced further sanctions, murderous sanctions on Iran. And it's something we should indeed be talking about.
Let me put this parenthetically in here because I think it fits. I was inspired in reading Norman Solomon's column on Counterpunch this morning. He had a quote from Wayne Morse from the Vietnam era.
I remember I met Wayne once.
Yes, you met, yeah.
I did, long
there
ago.
was, for those of us who are unfortunately this old,
yes.
the two senators who didn't vote for the Tonkin Gulf resolution in 1964 were Wayne Morse of the senator from Oregon, and Ernest Greening, the senator from Alaska, and Norman Solomon was inspired to put this up on his column this morning. When President Lyndon Johnson's iconic advisor, General Maxwell Taylor, and he was iconic, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ex-ambassador to South Vietnam, appeared before the Foreign Relations Committee on February 17, 1966. This exchange, preserved on video, so you could watch this if you look up the column, this exchange ensued. Senator Morse, we're engaged in a historic debate in this country. We have honest differences of opinion. I happen to hold to the point of view that it isn't going to be too long before the American people, as a people, will repudiate our war in Southeast Asia. General Taylor, that, of course, is good news to Hanoi, Senator. Senator Morse, Oh, I know that that's the smear artist that your militarists give to those of us that have honest differences of opinion with you. But I don't intend to get down in the gutter with you and engage in that kind of debate, General. I'm simply saying that in my judgment, the President of the United States is already losing the people of this country by the millions in connection with this war in Southeast Asia. And all I'm asking is, if the people decide that this war should be stopped in Southeast Asia, are you going to take the position that's a weakness on the home front in a democracy? And then General Taylor said, I would feel that our people were badly misguided and did not understand the consequences of such a disaster. And Senator Morse concluded this segment by saying, well, we agree on one thing, that they can be badly misguided, and you and the President, in my judgment, have been misguiding them for a long time in this war.
That's a wonderful exchange and a discussion from 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, of American war making and the misleading activities. Misleading is far too weak a word. That's why I'm hesitating. The propaganda activities of the American government to convince an anti-war public that these imperialist wars that the U.S. has been fighting for generations are necessary. In fact, within a few years of that exchange that you just read, David, 3/4 of the American public, 3/4 of the American public, may have been just over 70% according to the polls at the time, but almost 3/4 of the American public agreed with the statement that the war in Vietnam was not only a mistake, it was a crime. Now, what had happened is that the anti-war movement of the 60s convinced an overwhelming majority of Americans that the war the U.S. was carrying on was not only a blind alley or mistakes, but that we were committing crimes in Southeast Asia. Now, that's an anti-war movement that was doing what it should do, and Americans were drawing the appropriate conclusion. Many people have argued that the sort of unfettered television appearance of the actual of what was actually going on in Southeast Asia had a lot to do with Americans coming to that conclusion. That's right, but it's also the case that the real reason the U.S. withdrew its troops from the crimes that it was committing in Southeast Asia was the revolt of the American Expeditionary Force that we sent there. The draftees, the soldiers that the U.S. sent to Vietnam, refused to fight because they realized what they were doing. And this was something that the American government went to great efforts to hide from the American populace, because that war came to an end, that vicious war came to an end, only because of the opposition of the people who were fighting and dying in Southeast Asia, and the home front, the American populace that was supposed to support it, as General Taylor said there. That's what we need to report. What's happened is that the U.S. Government, the deep state, if you like, the political establishment, has spent 2 generations trying to erase that sort of opposition to use of American troops abroad. The ending of the draft was part of that, but the major part was the vast efforts of the world's greatest propaganda system, that is the American media, to convince Americans that, of course, we're fighting for truth, beauty, and the American way, and we should continue to do so. We should continue to kill people around the world to do so. And as a result, the United States, our country, is responsible for the deaths of some 20 million people since the Second World War to defend the profits of the 1%. This is one of history's great crimes, and we should not be cooperating in it.
It's a strange asterisk to the recent debate and the recent coverage that it seems to be taken for granted, even by mainstream columnists, that Trump's base is opposed to war. and what to do about that.
Yes, exactly.
What to do about that.
Right.
Conversely, it's taken for granted that the Democratic leadership, Schumer or Pelosi et al., is not anti-war. They're just tactically opposed
Right.
to what Trump did, partly because Trump did it, and partly because that's not their strategy. I assume these people would have promoted or did promote the maintenance of the Iran nuclear deal and the JCPOA and all that stuff. But it begs the question of who's anti-war and who's not anti-war, and where the anti-war movement proceeds from here in regards to Trump's base and any genuine effective anti-war movement that, I would love for an anti-war movement to also be a socialist movement and to be a genuinely leftist movement and to not have to deal with this sort of thing. But it's a start.
Yep.
It's symptomatic of the right, the quote unquote right in this country, that or Trump's base, that they're anti-war, and something of a populist nature of that feeds into this populist thing that's been going on. And again, I'm back to my concern about the fact that the anti-war movement, you just have to denounce Trump and you have to demonize his base. I can't imagine I would get along very well with very many of these people, but then again, I don't know.
You raise a very important point there, David. Those of us old enough to have lived through it, the 1960s and the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, know that movement began not as a liberal movement in the worst sense of the term, so to speak. That the extreme liberalism of the 1960s included this notion that what we need is a democracy such as John Kennedy represented. I mean, they really did start there, hard as it is to believe, and the fact that meant ignoring the fact that the war in Southeast Asia had been begun by Kennedy's attack on Vietnam in 1962. But in the midst of the 60s, the notion was the notion of the first student anti-war groups such as SDS was that what we needed was a popular discussion. Let the people decide was the original motto of the Students for a Democratic Society in the mid-1960s. What happened is very slowly the consciousness of how the war had come about and why the war was taking place, and the recognition that the war was a crime by the American ruling class, by the capitalist control, the oligarchs of America, that slowly led to an investigation by the movement itself of what sort of society had produced the crimes in Southeast Asia. Name the System was the title of the major operation in the mid-60s among the student anti-war movements, and what they were trying to say was, we've got to figure out why it is that the U.S. is committing crimes like this in Southeast Asia, and the answer was American capitalism. That was dangerous enough that the American establishment, spent literally 2 generations making sure that idea did not spread abroad. And we forget that sometimes in regard to that early anti-war movement, that the anti-war movement convinced Americans that what they were doing in Southeast Asia was a crime, and convinced Americans that crime grew out of the social and economic system that existed in 1960s America. Now, those are 2 points that need to be reasserted today against the tremendous attempt by the American propaganda system to erase them. That's what we should be talking about.
Yeah, it just it sort of occurred to me that back in the 60s we had a union movement, a strong union movement, which did not, by and large, oppose the Vietnam War.
That's true.
And a lot of controversy about that.
That's true.
Now we have the remnants of a union movement, while at the same time the majority of unionized workers now are public workers, are school teachers and government workers of various kinds, and so forth. And the question arises from that: what role? I haven't heard. I mean, there's been, of all the reports of teacher strikes and the union upsurge, and sort of what I consider really sort of overly optimistic reports about the revival of the union movement as a result of these. We can debate about that, but it's some of the rhetoric about that is a little over the top, and as far as I'm concerned, in terms of what's actually happened,
yes,
as positive as some of that has been. But how would an anti-war movement, given that schools are still ensconced with militarism, they are.
Absolutely.
Schools at all levels, not just defense spending at the U of I level, but propaganda of various kinds, sort of textbook-based propaganda at various kinds. What are we going to do about that? I know it's a big question, just occurred to me, whatever.
There are interesting straws in the wind, so to speak, here about this. One of the one that struck me recently was a campaign last month by the Pentagon to encourage students and recent post-students, so to speak, to join the military to pay off your student debt. This wasn't. This was a conscious political campaign, a propaganda exercise, an advertising campaign by the Pentagon directed at teenagers and people in their 20s about how they can deal with their major economic problem, which for a lot of these people is crushing student debt. Sure, join the Army and use your salary to pay off your debt.
Well, it would behoove the Bernie Sanders campaign to make some of these connections between anti-war and student debt and other social democratic reforms that he's identified himself with.
Right. There is, in fact, a discussion going on in various places, and we shouldn't ignore it. One of the most unlikely places, perhaps, is the local Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette, the failing newspaper that arrives on your doorstep less frequently now than it did a while ago. But Joseph Bowers, whom I haven't met, although perhaps you have.
Yeah, I've met him a few times.
A local letter writer to the News-Gazette.
Retired English teacher.
Has an important letter in this week's News-Gazette, in one of the few fora around in which issues like this are being discussed, that is, the said letters column. Bowers writes, "It's all the same lie. For my entire life, my government has lied repeatedly about pretty much every war it was engaged in. There are variations on the theme, but generally it goes like this. Some country, somewhere, or some evil dictator has misbehaved. Maybe the country has dared to embrace leftist ideals, or maybe the dictator has engaged in alleged atrocities. To the rescue is the United States, conveniently ignoring its own history of slavery and genocide. It's raised the most powerful and most expensive military machine in the world. It sends those forces all over, wrecking countries and leaving bodies strewn in the wake. This pattern is fueled by absurd tales, and the American public embraces them time after time. Iraqi soldiers ripping babies from incubators in Kuwait, vicious attacks on American forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, vast stores of weapons of mass destruction hidden in Iraq. All were untrue, but effective in setting the course for more war. The press cheerleads, and the U.S. Congress is fine with it all, in bed as they are with the military-industrial complex, which President Eisenhower warned us against over 50 years ago. When one candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, speaks out against these wars, she is immediately smeared as a Russian asset by warmonger Hillary Clinton. And now Iran, our two great criminal allies in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have been itching for this fight, and the U.S. won't let them down. That's Joseph Bowers writing in the News Gazette this week, and it seems to me that's unfortunately exactly right.
And I predicted last week that this would all blow over.
Well, you didn't
me.
make clear how it was
Lucky
going to,
me.
well, it was
Well,
going to
no,
be
I mean, I
mushroom cloud.
I wasn't thinking of the mushroom cloud, but
No, I'm saying there are a
it's
variety of ways in which you can blow over.
It's always remarkable to me what does blow over. The Khashoggi murder blew over, right?
Well,
People thought something
except
was
for
going
Khashoggi.
something was going to come of that, and I mean, last week I was saying this is going to blow over in a sort of positive sense, like there's not going to be an a ratcheting up of this war, but there's still the war,
Yep.
and the question is whether this movement or this upsurge has legs, or whether it's just whether the anti-war movement itself is just going to blow over. I know Chomsky would say, well, that's under our control and blah, 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 but, it's not really under my control. So there. Thank you, Joe.
Yes, indeed. I want to mention this morning's news conference by Pompeo and Mnuchin, the Secretaries of State and Treasury. They detailed new sanctions on Iran in a news conference this morning. The response that the Trump administration chose after backing away from further military conflict after Iran fired missiles at U.S. forces following Trump's order to kill Iran's top commander, Qasem Soleimani. This is a serious business. And it's interesting that the route that the U.S. government, the administration chooses at this point, is that of sanctions. Everyone says, oh my, isn't it wonderful that we're not going to outright shooting war. Of course, we are going to outright shooting war, but the sanctions are at least as devastating as that outright shooting war. Naturally, what the American government says, and the rest of the world knows they're lying, Mnuchin said the administration was committed, quote, to stop the Iranian regime's global terrorist activities, close quote. Well, as polls show, the world at large knows where the real terrorism comes from, which country in the world is the global terrorist. There's no doubt about that in any place except perhaps the editorial offices of the New York Times and the Washington Post. The rest of the world knows what the situation is. Wait a minute here. Back in the summer, Caitlin Johnstone, an Australian journalist who writes in American publications and elsewhere, produced a column that was titled "Starvation Sanctions Are Worse Than Overt Warfare." Quote, "We are putting major additional sanctions on Iran on Monday," President Trump tweeted in the middle of last June, and repeated, as I say today, by the cabinet secretaries. Quote, this is Trump in June, "I look forward to the day that sanctions come off Iran and they become a productive and prosperous nation again. The sooner the better." Well, that's Trumpism, perhaps. Iran's economy is already foundering due to the steadily mounting sanctions that the Trump administration has been heaping upon it since its withdrawal from the JCPOA, that is the Iran nuclear deal, last year. Crucial goods, this is in Iran, are 4 times the price they used to be, this is Iran last summer, sick Iranians are having difficulty obtaining life-saving medicine, and life in general has been getting much more difficult for the poorest and frailest Iranian civilians. This is the effect of American policy. For this reason, it's a very safe bet that there have been Iranians who have died because of the sanctions. Being unable to obtain enough life-saving medicine will inevitably increase mortality rates, as will inadequate nutrition and care for those whose health is at risk. There's not really any way around that, and it's only going to get worse. And that's exactly what was supposed to happen. As far as their intended purpose is concerned, the sanctions are working. They're doing exactly what they were intended to do: hurt Iranian civilians. How do I know this, writes Caitlin Johnstone? Well, for one thing, America's Secretary of State has said it openly. The New York Times reports the following. Last week, that is last summer, Mr. Pompeo acknowledged to Michael J. Morrell, a former acting director of the CIA, and no better than he should be, that the administration's strategy would not persuade Iranian leaders to change their behavior. Quote, "I think what can change is the people can change the government," he said on a podcast hosted by Mr. Morrell in what appeared to be an endorsement of regime change. What a surprise. The Trump administration isn't leveling these sanctions because it believes they'll cause Tehran to capitulate to Washington's impossible list of demands. They know full well that that will never happen. What they claim, based on no evidence or historical precedent whatsoever, is that by making life so painful for the hungry and malnourished Iranian people, they'll be forced to rise up against their government to effect regime change themselves. Can you think of anything more sociopathic than this? Off the top of my head, I personally cannot. Trump wrote in June, President Obama made a desperate and terrible deal with Iran, gave them $150 billion plus $1.8 billion in cash. What Trump was talking about was, in fact, the Obama administration's release of monies that belonged to Iran that had been confiscated by the U.S. and its control of the world's financial system. Trump continued, Iran was in big trouble, and he bailed them out. Well, that's gave them a free path to nuclear weapons. Of course, that's nonsense. The whole point of the deal was to be sure that Iran didn't produce nuclear weapons, which they said they didn't want to do, and agreed not to do in the JCPOA, in the agreement that the Obama administration signed. Instead of saying thank you to America, Trump wrote, Iran yelled death to America. I terminated that deal, which was not even ratified by Congress. and interesting thing for him to be concerned about, right? And imposed strong sanctions. That's the sanctions we're talking about. They are a much weakened nation today than at the beginning of my presidency. He's talking about the war against Iran, when they were causing major problems throughout the Middle East. Causing major problems mean resisting America's military activities in the Middle East. Close quote. Starvation sanctions kill people. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans have reportedly already died as a result of this administration's relentless assault on their economy, and these things are connected, particularly through oil, Venezuela being the major oil producer. Those human beings are no less dead than they would have been if the U.S. had killed them by dropping cluster bombs on Caracas. Yet these deaths have received virtually no mainstream media coverage, and Americans, while they strongly oppose attacking Iran militarily, have had very little, and that's the problem, the government's problem, that they've got to square the American people on these things, have had very little to say about Trump's attacks on the nation's economy. It's a effective and stealth measure to produce the same vicious result. The economy which people use to feed their children, to care for their elderly and their sick. I'm titling this essay, says Johnstone, Starvation Sanctions Are Worse Than Overt Warfare, and I mean it. I'm not saying that starvation sanctions are more destructive or deadly than overt military force in and of themselves. What I'm saying is the overall effect is worse because there's no public accountability for them and because they deliberately target civilians. If the U.S. were to launch a barrage of Tomahawk missiles into an Iranian suburb with the goal of killing civilians, there'd be international outrage and the cohesion of the U.S. centralized power alliance would take a major hit. Virtually everyone would recognize this as an unforgivable war crime. Yet America will be able to kill the same number of civilians with the same deliberate intention of inflicting deadly force, and it would suffer essentially no consequences at all. There's no public international pressure holding that form of violence at bay because it's invisible and poorly understood. And that's what the American administration and the persons of Pompeo, Mnuchin said this morning, the policy that they'll continue with. This is Caitlin Johnstone writing last summer. I'll put the essay, the whole essay, on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, but we should realize that that's a policy being followed by the United States, notably in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well, like Venezuela, in the world today. This has got to stop.
So in the last few minutes, let me refer to, once again, to New York Times Project 1619, and let me refer once again to Louis Proyect, who supports Project 1619, and let me refer to myself and others who oppose Project 1619, including the WSWS website, has a home page linking to many interviews and articles, I think very ably dissecting what the Project 1619 project is really doing. And this morning, Louis went more public with his complaints about Project 1619 in his Counterpunch column, which is usually a movie review. But he has to get it off his chest, and I'm glad he did, because I hope that there's a more public response from some of the principals involved in this controversy on the Counterpunch website than there has been. He wrote in one little snippet from what he wrote this morning. He said, even if Black Lives Matter had very little in common with the nationalism of the 1960s, its focus on black issues made it vulnerable to criticisms from WSWS, World Socialist Website, and Adolph Reed, who is Proyect's bête noire, who we comment on favorably consistently on this program. Proyect goes on, WSWS blasted Black Lives Matter as a quote-unquote pseudo-left organization hiding behind a racial narrative to account for the crisis of police violence. For his part, Reed wrote a Progressive magazine article stating that, quote, as a political strategy, exposing racism is wrong-headed and at best an utter waste of time. This is Adolph Reed, a black man, it should be said, being criticized for saying that exposing racism is a waste of time by a white man, Louis Proyect, if that matters. Let me just read a couple of things to defend Reed, or to further elaborate on how Reed feels about these issues. An article from the non-site, NONSITE website from last year. What a materialist black political history looks like. That is a materialist as opposed to a idealist racialist, where race and racism assume the sort of trans-historical status that Reed and his colleagues, the Field sisters and so forth, have been very firmly opposed to all these years. He wrote the following in this article about the Black Power movement from the 1960s. Black Power was not a mass radical insurgent movement. It was a militant expression of ethnic pluralism, meaning liberalism, basically. Radicals of various sorts, including ideological race nationalists, occupied its fringes, but the driving and commanding forces of Black Power politics were always the assertive elements within the new black political and professional managerial class that emerged from the opportunity structures opened by the victories of the civil rights movement. The dynamics of urban demographic demographic transition and incorporation into governing regimes, and war on poverty, model cities, and foundation-funded programs. Nominally radical groups such as the Black Panther Party, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and others with less cachet among the left were not serious alternatives, certainly not the romantic, quote, roads tragically not taken, unquote, of post-New Left fantasies. General Baker, longtime United Auto Workers activist and co-founder of both the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, was emphatically clear that those tendencies were entirely specific to Detroit and the centrality of the Union in local democratic politics. The BPP, the Black Panther Party, was founded in 1966, and by the end of the decade was already in disarray, especially outside Oakland, as a result of police repression, to be sure, but also of their political incoherence. And what Reed is trying to say here is that the allegedly revolutionary black movement, which has been criticized in recent years by him, the Field Sisters, by this fellow Cedric Johnson, who also publishes on the non-site website, really important articles to read as we challenge the people of the 1619 Project are the spawn of the black professional managerial class. They are transhistorically, abstractly understanding race and racism while supporting neoliberalism. These people are completely consistent with what Obama was doing for those 8 years. One more quick paragraph that Reed writes here. Neither Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, nor Stuart Hall, these are icons in the black racialist pantheon, can tell us anything strategically useful about the black American political situation. Appeals to their putative wisdom stem from academic leftists' romantic attachments and commitments to race reductionist politics. Malcolm was dead before nearly all the big events understood to define the 60s had occurred. Fanon died several years before Malcolm, and in any case, his focus was always elsewhere. He gave only the most general perfunctory attention to the United States. James's time in the United States, C.L.R. James, as I've said, was the political equivalent of a tourist visa. He was not enmeshed in black American politics and understood its internal and external dynamics in only an abstract formalist way. The same pertains to Stuart Hall. I won't go into Stuart Hall right now. Attachments to the likes of Malcolm, Fanon, James, and Hall are more totemic than intellectually or politically productive. There is a more pernicious aspect of embrace of those figures' supposed cultural authority. Each is read as propounding trans-contextual insights about race, quote unquote, and such insights are necessarily race reductionist. Those are important words from Adolph Reed that should be entered into the fray as it moves from WSWS to Counterpunch, hopefully by someone else or perhaps by me.
Thank you, David. That's important. You've been watching News from Neptune for the second week of 2020, a U.S. war crimes edition, reminding us that Martin Luther King said in April of 1967, something that is still, unfortunately, very true indeed: the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Kevin Lau. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.